Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. Today we have Michael Tsarion joining us. Michael, can you talk to us about the ideas and traditions known to the Greeks that influenced Jews and Christians?
Sure, that's a huge subject. You've had Professor MacDonald and Grimmikin on, who are the leading, to me, they're the leading minds on that. I've studied it myself for many decades. There's a lot to say on it. I wanted to do more, but what host brings you on to talk about that, right? It's really not that common, as Professor MacDonald said on the very last podcast that you did there. So it's still something amazingly that needs to come forth, but there are incredible parallels, and I'm so glad you invited me back to talk about this, because there's something that no one else has brought out really that needs to be brought about this cross-pollination between those two cultures. We do know things like most Christians know that the Greeks, after the time of Alexander, moving up towards AD, did translate. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. That alone should tell them that there was a lot of collusion between the two groups, and that there was a lot of interest. The Greek Empire, for one, somewhat similar to the Roman, was not violent, and it was very ecumenical and open and egalitarian. So there was a lot of cross-pollination. But apart from your two guests, and one other reference that I'll make later on, that I carry on like a Bible, there hasn't been that much interest in it extraordinarily, and I think we can guess why, because of what it does. But the first thing to say, there's so much to go into, and we'll get to direct examples of this Greek influence in a minute. But certainly, one wants to sketch in some background. You see, the origin of the Greek culture that we're talking about, coming out of the Mediterranean area, starts around about the second millennium BC. That's 2,000 years BC, around about the time that Abraham is walking the earth. In other words, where Judaism, now we're not talking about Ralph Ellis here, right? Let's for a moment bracket the masterly work of that man to show you who the Israelites really are, the Hyksos and all. Let's just keep that out of it, because that just is mind-boggling. So in comes Abraham from Ur, from the Chaldeans, the great patriarch that even Islam recognizes as a great patriarch. At this time, when Abraham is making a move south into the Holy Land, the Greek Empire, the empire hasn't started yet, but it's the earliest movements, the flicker. See, before that you had the Mycenaeans, and nobody knows really much about them. All that is known is that they vanished before this Abrahamic period off the face of the earth. Whenever you read that in history books, it's because cataclysm is taking place. They just don't want to admit cataclysm. So the Mycenaeans disappear into smoke. And the first elements of the Greek culture that would later become this empire, stretching up to Alexander the Great, it starts to move slowly to colonize the Mediterranean area. You're getting this. But again, the timing would be around the Abrahamic period, roughly. I mean, we're just talking roughly, right? So now, to people like myself who studied it for a long time, found it interesting, the way that the oral tradition moved up to Homer and Hesiod and others, Euripides, and then those ideas are found in Judaism, or even in the Christian Bible, in the story of Jesus, no less, is kind of obvious. But the trouble is, it's not obvious to everybody else, But both traditions, and this is not unique I'm not saying this is unique, but both cultures have certain similarity because they start with oral traditions. Now we know that Native American, Indian, and even Irish, that's true to a lot more than just Jews and Greeks, that they had an oral tradition, but it is something in common. Astrotheology, something again that would be left out by all commentators today. And in the past, that is common. Once you actually do the work and dig in to the anecdotes, Jesus walking on the water, or the fishermen crossing the lake, the casting of nets, whatever you find in the Greek or in the Hebrew, the Jewish, Israelite, whatever, obviously the default position is astrotheology. And maybe even Professor MacDonald and others don't even really grasp that. So, your show is very special here because you're bringing things together that even some of these top scholars would probably go, that's a head scratcher. Well, astrotheology, what's that? Of course, some are into it and some aren't, right? But these sidereal motifs and the story of the hero's journey, there's a lot there that is obscure to the reader, but the initiated person, you see, gets it and goes, And what I would always add then is, look, that doesn't come from those cultures. If those cultures were just 2,000 years BC, look, these astrotheological myths predate that. So maybe who were these Mycenaeans? Because if you're really going to talk about the Greek influence on Christianity and Judaism, who are these Mycenaeans? Who, in fact, for that matter, who are the other ancestral races of the Greeks that they themselves write about? Pelasgians? How many people Dorians, Ionians, Archaeans, and even Etruscans can be thrown in there somewhere. There's a lot of ancestral groups, and by that means that's not all there is. Greek, in fact, is really, if you really get into it, you'll find out that the Greek peninsula is dwarfed by the massive Turkish. This is with Anatolia, not Turkey as we know it today, nothing like that. An incredible Aryan empire existed just across the way. So there had to be a lot of intermarriage. Ralph Ellis has always pointed out that Cretans, stroke Hyksos, they might have been, or already had Minoans and Egyptians were connected. So the Mediterranean and much, much wider were all connected. But who are these ancestral races if you're going to talk about the Greeks? But back to the point, by the first millennia, we said that there's the beginning, the sort of the teething, the early stages of both cultures seem to coalesce in two millennia BC. But as you move up to 1 millennia BC, this is where the Greek Empire now has spread a bit, through colonies. They share at this point now, they become discernible. But yeah, let's turn to that list of 6 different or more different. These are the ones that I would say out of a whole mass of different similarities. So maybe could you read the first one at least, and we'll go from there.
They spread as the Jews did, diaspora-like, without a central locus of control.
Yeah. Central locus of control. You see, that's right. So one could look into that as being similar, right? We're not saying, oh, this is identical, but there is a similarity between the two cultures in terms of culture. Go to the next one.
The divine world occupied their thinking from earliest days.
Now, this one's more important because this is absolutely characteristic. That you find that from the very early period of these cultures, they're looking up. Gods matter to them. Their pantheon matters. What the gods do and the goddesses do. Look, the whole Roman and later modern, era is based on these gods and their derivations. Just because Mars changed his name to Ares, and all this, Cape or Juno and Hera, forget about that. The Prometheuses, the great gods, a clever person can see that there's even an Egyptian tie-in here, and all of this is still to be answered. Because even when you get certain motifs in the Greek, there's no doubt that there's a Phoenician, the Cadmean alphabet comes from the Phoenicians, not the Greeks, but the Greeks picked it up, this alphabet, and then became the Roman, and it obviously morphs over time, and so on you could go. But this one is interesting that the preoccupation is with spiritual matters. So there's a definite correspondence there. I'll go to the next one.
Supremacy of the word logos as the basis of all reality.
Oh my God. Book of John, in the beginning was the word. Well, I'm sorry, folks, that is not only Greek, it's a single individual within Greece, Heraclitus, the great philosopher. So it's not John. Very little in the book of John is John. Very little in the Gospels are those apostles, those names of the Gospels. All of that we know, but this one is particularly true. And to put this line, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, is just purely Greek. It's almost like they don't even want to hide it. But it's not just Greek. It comes from Heraclitus, who is one of these individuals who's going to play a part as we move through this, who is now saying, well, I don't know about these gods. Yeah, you got your gods. that's all right. And the same thing is going to happen in Judaism very early on, after the first temple was built, during the period of what we know as Deuteronomists. You're getting, after that period, you get the same kind of, the gods, Elohim, Baal, El Shaddai, Yahweh, Asherah. You go, So Heraclitus on the Greek side is saying, yeah, you got your gods, but I think it's more to do with an underlying energy that I'm calling logos. Well, guys, logos is the Greek for word. So in the beginning was the logos. Comes out of Heraclitus, and he is the Greek. He also served the Persians. He was very friendly with the king of the Persians, you see. So this is the zeitgeist of the time. It's nothing original to somebody called John or to the Christians or anything like that. So that one we could unpack ad infinitum. The very fact that a word, a central word, is considered the basis even of the gods. Heraclitus did connect it with fire, tentatively. It's fire-like, it's energy. He's basically energy or force, or even will or animus. There's been a million terms, used for it. But this man discovers this, and it turns up in the Bible. Well, that's interesting because, as we said on previous programs, David and Goliath and the most beautiful men in the world turn up as Lucifer. There seems to be a lot of things turning up from the four corners of the world in the scriptures. But go to the next one.
Moved from henotheism to monotheism.
Yeah, not strictly them alone, but again, a movement. What we're looking at is an interesting movement that runs along historical grounds. The Greeks start with this big pantheon, but as time goes by, they become more and more interested only in the one God, not just this underlying logos, but a central principle. This may be higher than these bickering gods. The next one.
That the gods were human-like.
Yeah, see, now you're dealing again with very close bridges. Some are a little further away, but others are almost, right close. The bridge is very short, and that is the same thing in Judaism. Now, some Jews think of the God as very impersonal and far away. But as we moved on more towards the Christian message, and then you have your Messiah as well. And then you have your Els and your Baals, Baal meaning Lord. So they're not as remote as some of the more esoteric Jews who think of their God as a very distant and remote thing. There's a Grecian element here as well. And in any case, even Yahweh, when Moses meets him up on the mountain, this is pretty human-like, wrathful, vengeful, and all of that. And of course, it's undoubtable that this anthropomorphization existed, but how many point out that the Greeks had it? Like you can't even believe. And it's very common to Christianity to anthropomorphize deity in the way that the Greeks were also doing. Go to the next one.
That goodness is holy and preferred.
Yeah, this is another element. The Jews certainly believe that living a good life. See, whereas Calvin, it doesn't matter if you live good. If you want to do good, do it, but it doesn't make one bit of difference. God has already judged you for hell, and that's it. But the Jews didn't teach that. Of course, there's many different schools within Judaism, but generally the idea was try to do as much good on this planet as you can. And the Greeks already had that too. That in the essence of what is, whether it's the logos or even bringing votives and sacrifices to the gods, it's good. Trying to be good to the god. And also the gods are themselves at their heart good. They're not merciless, they're not evil, they're not vampiristic. You get some who are and in their mythologies, but ultimately the base of everything is goodness. And you get this. Remember the Greeks? Beauty is goodness. They took it so far that they believed that anything beautiful was inherently good. They were wrong there, all right, but you see the trend of what they were thinking. That goodness is very, very important and mostly preferred when it comes to a sacerdotal life. A sacerdotal life will represent service to others, obedience to God, and all of those goodly things.
First to compose holy books, writing became essential to spiritual practice.
Yeah, that doesn't need an explanation. A very common thing between the two. By the time of Deuteronomy, especially in Judaism, the book became important. They'd found this book as they were building the temple. And they came out. The thing we're going to discuss is that they opened it to the people. But before we even get to that remarkable event, by the way, both cultures at almost the same time start thinking that, not just to think, but to write down and then to hold those books as important and sacred. We certainly know the Jews did this with the 10 Commandments and the tablets and the holier books and the rabbis and their scrolls. but the Greeks were onto it already as well. And then thinking of the book itself, even Homer, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Hesiod, all of these guys, it was considered sacred works. I mean, these were like, you can't even believe the amount of, the Greeks in the whole of the empire with these books under their arm, using phrases, catchphrases, anecdotes, similes. These books were holy. All of the great histories of the Greeks were holy. And, this, all of it, one could get into it. But again, just even thinking only of Odyssey or Iliad and books of that nature, and the Euripides, and then Aeschylus, and all of this, these are actually considered almost divine scripts, actually.
Selfhood matters.
Yeah, this is the key of what we're going to talk about today, but we'll skip it briefly and move on. But it's obvious that something is happening even in the personality of the worshipper. We'll get to that in a minute. What's next?
God cares for the ordinary folk, not just kings, warriors, priests, and prophets.
Conceded by the temple, not all of the Jewish priests, they thought of themselves as very high, of course, but a great many. Israel was loaded with priests, and these Deuteronomists particularly started to concede to this. It's one of the reasons they opened the scriptures to be read by the ordinary housewife or shepherd or whatever, because it really started to devolve that, look, it's not just David and Solomon and Cyrus the Great and the ones who are, ministers of the God or the Pharaoh, hey, the little shepherd. David started as a shepherd, didn't he? So there was a shift here that's often not noticed. These are things we need to, get through to the audience. And in Greece, it was happening the same, that the little shepherd boy, the little fisher kid, a humble blind person, like you say, the ordinary urbanite, God spoke directly to them, could do, and animated them, and celebrated their individualism, and spoke to them directly, even if God wasn't speaking abroad to everybody else. So this is the nascence, the seed of individualism. We'll be talking a lot more about that in a minute. Let's go through the list. What was next?
That a human can become godlike.
That's right. From down, up, and from up, down. From down, up. You can listen to the voice of God, but there's another action, isn't there? There's David becoming animated. There's Samuel, Saul, but you have it on the Greek side as well, that the individual can be God-inspired, God-animate, and also then move up in rank from the lowly position that you're in to godhood. These are ideas, you see, we forget about. You didn't get that in Egypt. The God is the Pharaoh, mate, and that's it, and everybody's in their place. So something also is going on here where the idea is coming into the mind that I can rise above my station. I don't have to be born in a priestly class. I don't have to be special in that particular sense. I can move, autonomously towards a spiritual divine beinghood. Very, very important. And these ones that we've gone through are by no means the only ones, But by the time of Alexander the Great, he came on in the 4th century, like 300 BC. Those that you've mentioned and others are now firmly found in Judaism. Now, we've already pointed out one that's original, and that was the idea of a word and a logos. Well, why do the rest not need to be Greek originally? We don't know. I'm not saying they are, but since one is definitely to be found, solidly in the Grecian world rather than the Jewish world, but it crossed over, hey, that opens the door, doesn't it, to the whole concept of how many others of the ones we've gone through and many others as well cross-pollinated. So absolutely cross-pollination existed. And by this 4th century BC, you find these elements. And later, as the Jews and the Greeks start really cohabiting and all of that. Now, the real big date, as we'll see, in terms of what we're going to get into, is 8th century BC. But we'll get to that in due course. It's just that by the 4th century and later periods, you really do see these Grecian elements. So these dates are important to keep in mind. And especially if somebody is interested in actually, reading the Jewish Bible and all of that, and the Christian the Christian scriptures from later on. It has to be said that this cross-pollination existed. Now, the thing, though, what we want to do after confirming what your guests are saying and adding those, the important thing is really, the thing of utmost importance is to sort of carry on from where we were with the Julian Jaynes discussion. And people could, really need to go back and check that one out to get a grip on what we're talking about here, because he was a man who brought up questions like, what is religion anyway? Why are we all preoccupied with it as a human? Why is it a human phenomenon in the first place? Underlying questions, rather than just being a believer, you step back and start to say, what is the phenomena of religion? And then again, I would say that in that list, as we'll see by the end, there's another truth concealed within that list that very few people in the world would ever notice. You'd have to be familiar with Jaynes. You'd have to be familiar with Owen Barfield, the great colleague of C.S. Lewis, who spotted it and had a great deal to say. He wasn't a Christian himself. He was into German Romanticism and the English equivalent. He was a great German romantic and idealist, a British idealist and romantic, but very much in the tradition of not only Rudolf Steiner, but Hegel and Schelling and all of that. We don't want to spend time on that. But the thing that's in that list that is hard, it is hard for somebody to put their finger on unless you were familiar with Julian Jaynes's work and Barfield. So I would say definitely to make sense of this, people would need to go back and look at the one we did. It's excellent anyway. Right? So what I really wanted to continue a little bit of what I was saying there before about identity. That's the human identity. How did that develop? The sense of selfhood and I-ness that we have. That has an etiology. Everything in this world develops through historical stages. So what about I? What about the kind of thinking that we know today and the subjectivity? And this is where, Julian Jaynes come in, and he has his interpretation, but it doesn't mean it's the only one, and it doesn't even mean it's right. He spoke about the metaphysical internalization. Remember, there's really no pockets in the brain, where you find this little self running around cartoon-like, so where's this voice coming from? And then we went into all of that about what he had. Owen Barfield's theories run along similar lines. And then it's not just identity. What Barfield is trying to show is that it's not just the human identity, it's the divine identity has changed. And he noticed that they've run together. Two critical processes happening together. He clearly said is that monotheism as we know it and individualism as we know it run together. They develop together through time. And the Greek-Jewish parallels are where to look to, find evidence for this. Around about this time of the 8th century BC, there is what scholars have called a Great Awakening that takes place in terms of identity and selfhood that wasn't there before. And studying Greek art gave people an indication that something mentally had changed. Now, when you go back to the Jaynes thing, you'll remember me making the point that most scholars know that what we call selfhood is very recent historically. And so different dates have been offered. But this one is very strong. This 8th century BC is kind of strong. It's not the only one that could be offered, but it's certainly the strongest one that I think would gain a lot of consensus. 8th to 6th century, something's happening in terms of personality. Not just personality, social changes as well, but in the psyche, the psychology of man. And this is why it's always fascinated me. Right? So simply said, is the consciousness that we know today. It is recent, historically, and it wasn't always the rule, which begs the question, well, then what kind of, how did the ancestors think? And of course, that's where the whole thing then breaks down, really, because you have to be a Julian Jaynes or a Barfield to work it out, because ultimately, how can we know? We're not there with our TV cameras. We can't falsify any statement that would be made. but you can get an intuitive gist from poetry, from music, from certain things in our own lives that are alluded to by James and by Barfield, and you go, yeah, that makes sense. That looks like it might come from a different kind of consciousness. Well, after all, what are football stadiums? What is our penchant for collectivism? Look at the mass hysteria that we know today, where one thing becomes a meme, and even, you know, masses upon masses of people in completely foreign parts of the country, in the world, are latching onto it. So there's certain communal things that also that seem to have spread, you know, like these memes, right? But it's just crucial to remember that the ancients thought differently than we do, perhaps even radically, and they thought about everything. Now, we can't go into everything. All we can do is, what did they think about themselves? How did early man, Jewish, Greek, whatever, Irish, what was their thinking about self? Now, Julian Jayne says there wasn't even any thinking about self. Now, we can't even conceive of that. So this is a little bit, you know, what we want to explore, that I bring to this whole question of the Greek influence, because it's in Greek literature that this was first substantiated, the things we're talking about. A Barfield is looking to Judaism, looking to Christianity, but when they looked at the Grecian stories, they found their evidence, whatever evidence there was. So in Judaism, around the 8th century BC, this is the age of the Deuteronomists. The temple is being built. This holy works are discovered, Deuteronomy. And this caused a change because the priests of the time did something quite extraordinary. And they said that ordinary people come into the temple can be given tracts of this Deuteronomy to read. And since it's the word of God and it's the song, the story of the race, it's the saga, we want the ordinary people, because before that was off limits. What do you think? What do you need a priesthood for? So, and then the upshot of this, because there's a lot of ground to cover, but in brief, the Deuteronomy began a new age of God being a phenomena within. It's right there in the Deuteronomy. God is within you, which had never been said before. Look at Greece, the gods were always outside. Look at Judaism. If you worshiped the god, you had to go to a grove. You had to go to a stone, like the Bethel stone. You had to go to a high place, especially if you worship the goddess. But even if you worship the god, you know, like why did Moses go to the mountain? Sinai, Horeb. And on. It was always a place on earth identified as the place from which the god spoke, or where you felt closer to God. The Celtic lands, pre-Celtic lands are full of this. Deuteronomy, 8th century BC, that kind of stops, or by the 6th century, it's going to stop. God is now within you. You are Bethel. You are the temple of the living God. This would culminate with Jesus centuries later. But wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, what's going on here, Barfield said, the divine is internalized, which begs the question, well, what kind of reality was it before God was internalized? Because we all have that. We're all descendants of that internalization through Christianity and the programming and the beliefs in it. Well, what did they do before? We would, rightly ask, and that's what then, opens up. We don't have time to explore all of that. So the priests allow the ordinary folks to read the book of Deuteronomy. And from there on, basically, Jews were allowed to contemplate the scriptures themselves. Took Christianity a bit of a time to catch up with that, but there you have it. Now, prior to that, of course, Barfield talks about that the ancestors before this, actually, he says this state that I'm going to mention lasted up until about, 1,000 years AD and started to fade only 1,000 years AD. And it's called original participation is the term that he used. He used other terms. As that faded, you get things like reciprocal participation. But we have time only to talk about this. And then later, as it devolves completely, we get what he called is the age of idolatry. But not too systematic a writer. Basically, idolatry, I personally believe he meant that came in a lot earlier too. This crossing over point between original participation fading and then the age of idolatry. And I really think, that it goes back BC as well. But these things overlap, right? But original participation, which is a kind of state of consciousness we could never, ever really grasp anymore, except maybe when listening to music, like I said, these numinous experiences. But the whole of the world had it. All the races had it. And by the time they became identifiable races, it's lost. You see, it maps across what Julian Jaynes was saying. Now, this leads to something very interesting. So bear with me here, right? Oh, and by the way, if Ralph was talking here, he'd say, well, maybe this has to do with the age of Aries passing into the age of Pisces, because there's a processional action here as well. So, we're making things brief that we could really explore in detail. We just want to keep it that why religion? Remember the phenomena of religion, but religion isn't worldwide. Religion is divided into these priestarchies and sects. There's Jews, there's Muslims, there's Christians, there's Jews, there's Jains. And then a million different denominations within Christianity. We're looking at this phenomena. And we've already established that the phenomena of religion itself and worship in God develops, especially monotheistic type of religion, as the concept of individuality also develops historically down through time. Something that would fascinate the philosopher Hegel, because history is key to all of this. But we even have then, as I said, the procession, which also, clever people will take on board there. But don't you see also that something's happening with these priests of the Deuteronomist age? At this exact time in Judaism, the many gods are being shrunk into the one. And the whole question of Yahweh's supremacy at the end, well, Yahweh was really sort of like not that important of the sort of a moon god. And in my Trees of Life book, I track all that back. It's actually a tree god, believe it or not. Probably one of the reasons why you get Christmas trees in your house, right? At Christmas. But the thing is, no, Yahweh was a minor sort of god, just like Aton had been in Egypt. And then suddenly Baal and El Shaddai and El and whatever you got, Asherah, Anat. My goodness, the list goes on. All of these gods, the volcano god, the fire god, they're just banished, and they become the Elohim. One school of thought, because Elohim is a word that goes back to the Egyptian Alim, Aleim, and it sort of connotated the followers of the god Ta, demigods who followed the All-Father Ta, if you have to get into it. But then it was adopted by other peoples and other cults. But it was the number 9 seemed to be always going along with this Elim, or the Elohim, the 9, the Council of 9, the gods of the 9. So the Jews are doing something very similar. They bracket the other gods. We're almost banishing them, and we have one. We picked Yahweh, right? But then, of course, Yahweh, the name Jehovah, is then divided into the 4 sacred letters, with each letter being a god, or God, IHVH. He's 4 in 1, he's 3 in 1, he's a trinity. The whole thing is still henotheistic, for goodness sake. They're doing their best to bring one god out of the pantheon, whether they did. The trinity is a leftover of the Elohim, the quaternity of the tetragrammaton in Judaism is a leftover from the Elohim. Nice try, guys. But really what this does is it confirms Julian Jaynes' idea, because if you're shrinking the gods to one, what did he say about the audial hallucinations? Many gods spoke to us. It's also a psychological, because we've always got to keep the sinew, the connecting tissue between what's happening psychologically and what's happening theologically here. Otherwise, the whole thing, comes apart. So Julian Jaynes is confirmed here, because that's exactly what happened internally, where the voices of the gods shrunk away, sort of evaporated, dissipated, and we get, the one central ego voice, which we take for ourselves. The voice you hear in the head is your voice, right? Well, you put the signature on it. I don't know anything more about that. Maybe some mental deception going on. I don't know. But in the pre-Homeric in Greece, in the pre-Homeric, this is before the great writings, as I said, the land had been ruled by this mysterious group called the Mycenaeans, and they vanished. And slowly this Greek empire starts to expand, and other places fall under, its jurisdiction. The Jews will also fall under its jurisdiction. So in all of this, we also have this other thing that we started with about who is borrowing from whom. And the thesis now looks like the Jews are the ones that are actually in the receiving end. Probably not all, right? Because the Greeks did translate the Hebrew Bible and probably had a lot of interest. In fact, I'm doing work later on that shows that they were very favorable to Judaism, and there was a lot of leakage back and forth. Let's remember that. And could this be also with the idea of the gods? See, in the Greek pantheon, the gods, like in India and other places, is always some external fates. Think of all the Furies, what do you call them? The Graces, what's the other one? The three muses and the rest of the pantheon are sort of external beings that seem to affect you as if my neighbor affects me or the king has affected me. It's like the external fates pass judgment on my life. They're external forces. Now, this is changing in Greece, just as it's changing in Israel, where the force that moves you decrees what you're going to do, or if you're a sinner or not sinner. This is all moving to the interior. And by the time of the playwright Sappho and by Euripides in Greece, this is happening, as there's more of a concretization, as you read, of individualism. So by the 6th century BC, they've noticed these scholars, because remember, people go, where's the evidence? Well, the evidence turns out to be in pottery and artifacts, because they're noticing such extraordinary changes in design. Lots of spirals, lots of geometric shapes prior to the Homeric period, closer to the Mycenaeans. And then as we get more to this period of Euripides, it's changing. Also, these weird, almost insect-like human beings. Well, let's make it simple. There's no facial features of any individualism in the early period. It's just a strange kind of mask-like face and weird sort of insect-like bodies, and no distinguishing marks. Just like later perspective came in late. Well, in the later period of the Greeks, you start getting actual character faces with expression, proper human expression, for instance. And also the form of the body becomes also more realistic. And then there's also perspective. So faces have expression, bodies look more realistic as we would recognize them instead of sort of unusual looking, animal-like, and perspective comes in. Now, these are big, big, big things that show that there was this sort of great awakening when it came to somebody's relationship with the planet and with the world and with reality. Did you know that up until this time, very late in the day, there was no word for living body? The word soma, which everyone points to and go, oh, well, they had soma, it meant corpse. It actually meant that which is no longer with us, that which is emptied of life. Soma, still used today, somatic. Well, wait a minute, what the hell? Why? Is because they said that something had vanished. Is James right then? That we are soma? We're walking around, we think we're living, but actually the gods have vacated us in this state of original participation, so to speak, and that's been lost. Well, that's what Barfield says. Barfield says, yeah, you are corpses now. You've lost the original participation. You've got something else. It's called religion, right? Incredible. But then they studied also literature of this early period and discovered that, as I said in the previous podcast, there's not much in the way of private rumination in either the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. Again, you're directed to do things and you respond to those directions, but you don't sit ruminating, and there's not much private journaling. Suddenly that comes in. Suddenly around the 8th century, and towards the age of Sappho and Euripides in Greece, this starts coming in where private thoughts are being discussed. People are pacing up and down and contemplating and speaking about how they're feeling and thinking within. That level of expression is, again, historically recent. You get more contemplative characters. You get the beginnings of biography. That we would, if you read Hamlet, you accept it. Hamlet is a very modern figure, isn't he? woe is me, and to be or not to be, that is the great question, right? That looks like a modern character, and nobody would stop and balk. But that is completely historically recent. Characters in plays for thousands of years did not do that. And so when they started doing it in the Greek theater and all, it was like, hey, run that guy out of town. What's that? Who's this playwright? Something had changed. And by the 5th century is when we first get in art perspective, to be precise about that. So people can think nothing of any of this, or they can just say, well, no, those are remarkable psychological changes. So the key thing that's happening from the Deuteronomist period onwards is this internalization of divinity. But here's the weird twist in that. You can't suddenly, because they know this, that groves, hills, altars, even temples and churches are starting to be abandoned as people like maybe have a little altar in their home or the sacred text. And you don't necessarily even have to go to the temple anymore at this point. And that was considered okay. They'd like it if you did, but if you stayed at home, so what? God is within you. But if God is within me, Barfield is saying, aren't you important now? Because we're talking about this concretization and reification into individualism. We said that the two went together. Monotheism runs along individualism. Yes, it does. Because the moment that I really understand that the God is within me, not down there in Thebes or in Jerusalem, something happens to me on a psychological level. I'm kind of like important now, right? So there's an egoistic aspect to this. Don't make it with a prejudicial statement at this point. It's just that you feel much more important as a person. Look at Moses. Wasn't Moses one of these guys that was first animated by, and he could walk anywhere he went? You don't see him doing anything more than having a portable tabernacle or whatever. That's what I mean. Now, you thought that the priests would have said, oh, we can't be giving them Deuteronomy. We don't give them any books because that's the end of us. For some strange reason, they did. And I think it's because of some, cataclysmic things that were happening. And in order to galvanize the public, this happened. But, that's another story. The main thing is they took the chance and they said, we'll still be needed to interpret. And that's exactly what happened. The Levitical priests and the priests of the temple became liturgical. They became the ones that said, if you have a problem reading the scripture and you're not aware, you can't work out what God means here, we are there to, explain it to you. But we'll just give you our explanation. It's not taking away from yours. So the roots of where we are today is to be found in its rudiments, of course, back there, where a certain amount of freedom. And if you have to then interpret the scripture on your own, don't you have to have a reason? Don't you have to be sort of worldly wise? Don't you have to have an intellect? So coalescing are all these mental categories, mental capacities that we have today. Priest is still there, as he is today. Make that of what you will. But ultimately, you're meant to sit in your home, in your domicile, read the text, and then as you're farming or whatever you're doing, think about it. Now, this is remarkable. But what Barfield is saying, yeah, it's remarkable, all right. Think of what is really happening here. There's a devolution. There's a concentration on the individual's mind. Whereas before, there was a very different dynamic. So there's a certain abandonment then of churches, temples, holy places, and even admonitions in the Bible about to abandon them. By the way, if you really get into it, the kings and priests are asking the public to throw over these pagan places. But it just simply tells, somebody would say, well, what did they do then? Before this, what did a pagan type of mind do when he was at the stone or when he was at the temple site? So you got questions, right? From now on, you could just have a moving altar, a moving tabernacle, a moving set of scrolls or whatever. And this is exemplified in the story of Moses. So the idea is that if you are the God bearer, then you're special. And this sense of ego identity, right? We asked earlier on about identity, subjectivity, selfhood, the kind of person you are, the kind of thinking that you have. We're moving slowly towards the prey now. Something is changing. And what Barfield is asking is it God that matters then? at the end of the day, the cynic or the critic, he's saying, if this ego inflation is taking place, at the end of the day, am I into my religion and my God because of religion and God, or because I have this, I'm the Jack the Lad here. I embody God. Didn't you not know that? Right? And since people like myself have always talked about self-deception lying at the heart of all syndromes, maybe we should give that thought. At the end of the day, somebody can question, is it really that there is a God now? Or a divinity, or something really worth worshiping that's holy? Maybe there even is. But if alongside this, there's this other vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Right? So that running alongside, where are we? Is that incidental? We got questions. Now, around about this time, moving up towards the 4th century, but even before that, you get in Greece the age of the philosophers. Now, your previous guests, of course, didn't touch on this, but it's key to what we're mapping out. The age of the philosophers. We just talked about reason and logic and asking deeper questions about metaphysics and an attitude of life. You get your Stoics later, you get your Cynics later. People are asking, what way shall I live given what I know about reality? All of this is in the head, leading up to Plato, Aristotle. These are the age of the philosophers. Probably starts with Anaxagoras. He was contemplating the mysteries of nature for almost the first time, which would, as I say, lead up to Aristotle. But there was a lot of others, right? There's changes. It's almost like the age of the philosophers signals a period where people are coming out of, say, a trauma and saying, "Oh, look at the world around us again," because they're questioning, they're measuring, they're thinking. They're doubting. Remember, who was it? Was it Democritus, or it might have been Anaxagoras, who was the first one, or one of the others, who said, "I don't even think that the sun and moon are gods." See, heretical thoughts like that. He said, "I think they're just like burning globes of fire, that move on their own orbit." This kind of thing. This kind of re-looking at the world. Why would you want to do that? Well, it's because something has changed subjectively within you. Well, if you thought of and also, if you did think that they were gods before, is that something of the original participation? Then that breaks or fades. And then you start going, I wonder if they're just big hunks of fire in the sky. See? By the time you get to Pythagoras, man, it's like the rudiments of our own science today. And actually, he was murdered by the crowd. Usually this is what happens to anybody who does do any free thinking, right? But he was murdered. Others were murdered because they did doubt and they did question. This was the era in which people like Aristotle, Democritus, Anaxagoras, Pythagoras started to take a theory and go to seek for evidence to prove it. Take a hypothesis and then seek to prove it. But of course, again, you get this bugbear. It's something I'm doing. At the center of all of this activity, scientific or other, in the questioning mind is the I that is doing the questioning, which is getting stimulated, which is getting a little bit of animated because of this. And so by the time this Heraclitus, say Parmenides, whatever, you are getting this great questioning even of the gods. You're getting this individual who's standing up to question the gods. Well, who is this creature? Like we said, it was Heraclitus who then decided that there's a fire element called the logos, or the word when it's translated, that is out there. And the word logos has enormous other meanings as well, many, many connotations. But it animates all life. And it was there at the beginning, and it's eternal. What doesn't that turn up in the New Testament, in the book of John? This underlying everlasting principle, it's traced back to the Greeks, as we said. But the two things are happening. In the Jewish world, there's a strengthening of individual identity, and in the Greek world, this is happening as well. And of course, the figure of Jesus, as he's described in the scriptures, not by Ralph Ellis and all of that, that figure, as described in the Bible and various other works, is a sort of a concretization, the ultimate, really, he's really the embodiment of what we're talking about, the embodiment of the man God-man. Whether you had other versions of it is irrelevant, because this is what it's all about. And well, just like the gods got restricted to one, Yahweh, so does the panoply of God-men get shrunk. Even the Jewish Messiah is there, sort of in the background, but he's more a political figure. When it comes to these solar kings, these solar gods, Jesus is eventually going to reign supreme in the Christian world, coalescing out of what had happened in the past. He's the end point of that journey. So, thank Paul for that. That was just the myth mongering of St. Paul, Josephus Flavius, that aided that on. But what Barfield would say is, no, not just that. What drove Paul to want to do that? It had happened before. Yahweh was condensed and coalesced out of previous gods. Jesus is taken from a bit of the Messiah, from Apollonius of Tyana, from Jesus of Gamala. You got a lot of stuff back there, and he coalesces out of these sort of God men. Why are the public going for it? What is Paul responding to? He's the PR man for it. He's the myth monger, but something in the psyche of the human. You can invent anything. You can stitch up anything. Why does the world accept it? Why do we still accept a pope? Why a Muhammad, right? Why any of it? Because there's a need now for this central icon of the human being that embodies the divine, that others will follow to the ends of the earth. It became practically a Jesus cult, custom made for people who have themselves embodied the spirit divine within, but they still want, there's still some hearkening back to it in the external way, the one on the hill. So the original participation is still there, but it's in a very, very stripped down, and yet at the same time, it has a great power over us. It hasn't completely vanished. We still need the external icon and the trappings of that icon, like the hill, Golgotha. You'll still see elements of the original participation in all of this. And after all, even the reciprocal participation or idolatry is still participation. It's just participation, way, way condensed. Many, many steps lower than it used to be. But again, hidden within this factor, logos, what's really taking place right now, again, is the internalization of that logos. It's not something I'm in, it's something that's in me. So I must then make that house clean for the logos, or the light, just say the light. Christians, the light. Well, if I am an embodiment of the light, I need to recognize that and live goodly and live morally so I can embody it. But more than that, because there's still work to do, and therefore only if I'm clean and sensitive and pure can I really commune with what is within me. The message of Jesus is like this. Most prophets are. Try to cleanse yourself because you'll get more. It's very based in what will I get. So now that the light, the pneuma, is within me, I must do justice to that. And if I do, I get more pneuma, I get more light, I get more insight. I talk to God. The light of the divine picks on me and says, you're a better disciple, you're a better apostle, you're the beloved one. In other words, I feel special. And this sense of superiority is absolutely characteristic of religious types. It's Gnostics have it. They're always talking about how special they are and how damned everybody else is and blind. And unfortunately, it goes with other types as well. Now, this in turn leads us then to a key point. Well, when a baby is growing and keeps asking mommy and daddy, why? Obviously, you can see that it's not sitting there taking note of the answer as much as it likes the sound of its own voice. There's an identity there asking why. And in a baby's mind, that process of self-reflexivity is as important, if not even more important, than any particular answer that's thrown its way. This is because its interest in itself is coming to bear. That's what we're talking about in the baby, levels of history, in the early development of peoples in terms of society. This actually is phases that we went through. If I ask a question, I know myself as questioner. If I think about something, I know myself, I reconfigure myself, reintroduce myself as thinker. And there's something really, wild and wonderful about that. And so it was with all humanity. Now, if we embody the divine, then really, to all intents and purposes, we are as important as the divine itself. And this takes hold. So you can come at it like saying the whole thing is just vanity on steroids. And that's why religion is still around. That's why these hoary priests are still around, plaguing the world. We're not ruled by archons, or we're not ruled by, the demiurge and all of that. We're ruled by this transformation that once we had a state of consciousness, unless your whole left brain has been taken out, and people have had that happen, and then they claim to be in this state that is completely numinous. But for the masses, we don't have that original participation. We have the reciprocal participation because we live in urban environments. Things are becoming more and more cosmopolitanized as time goes by. The Greeks had it as the Jews had it, and the Romans just adopted it, third hand. But we're now looking at the longevity and also the attractiveness of religion in all of this. So maybe the priests already saw this happening. They understood, because they knew it was a danger in order to set this all in motion. But maybe they decided that it was a process that had to occur. And in the end of the day, they're not really losing out a lot. Religion is here to stay because it's articulated to, has very, very deep connective tissue to vanity and egoism. And this could explain a great deal if you think about it. Now, with any process any process is bound to at some point. Yeah, the way to look at it is that this process has also some negatives in the sense that now, because God is within me and we're worshiping at the holy place, and we don't need to tend the grove and we don't need to tend the sacred tree, don't you see that it's all happening in here? It's not in nature anymore. So a divide is taking place, probably part of what Barfield was talking about, that the self and the world, and by the way, even the self and the other person, there's a sort of like a very strong divide that has occurred there now. Does that lead then to the Cartesian cogito? I think, therefore I am, right? Where my thinking is the definition of my beinghood? Well, yeah, it does. All of these things are moving up to where we are today. One would then say, like Barfield was kind of saying, look, is any of it natural then? And his answer was really no, although he understood it. He called it idolatry. Mentioned this earlier, that when the original participation fades and you get these other forms of participation, but because they're so stepped down in amplitude, and we're sort of not even able to really grasp, except at very special moments. And also any tribes or other peoples that did have original participation, because he says it did actually last up until the first millennia AD. Yeah, but not with most of our ancestors. And by the time the Teutonic Knights and the Catholic Church had laid waste to Europe, scourged all the trees and forests, Ireland, every single tree was uprooted, and then they burned the roots so that they couldn't even come back. This is all in very recent times. So this scourging of nature obviously is understood in this context. And so if you go to the Bach saga and the Finnish people, they talk about how devastated their natural world was as well. Things were built over, even churches today were built over sacred sites all throughout Europe. All of that travesty, the anthropomorphization of gods that were obviously animal gods before. What we get, Barfield is saying, we have no time to explore it now, is that we entered into an age of idolatry. And so this thickening and hardening of a self with the flow of monotheism and those kinds of solar beliefs is really moving out of original participation into this age of idolatry. Now I have an article on the michaeltsarion.com website called Age of Idolatry, and it'll go into a lot more detail than we can do here, right? But another conundrum involves then our search for meaning, since that's what religion pretends to be about. I now, since this Grecian time, Odysseus setting out on his 12 hurdles, Hercules on the 12 hurdles, Jesus with his 12 disciples, all of these stages, I am going through it as an individual. And today, when I seek for meaning, it's something I am doing. I'm leaving my footprint along the way. I've often asked in some of my other programs about whether or not when we seek out, when we step out on an adventure, is it because we're really seeking a particular goal? Or is it because we just want to feel the horse's hooves on the cobblestones and the wind in our hair? It's unanswerable, because especially if there's self-deception involved, you'll always, I'm setting out with an absolute, I've got a total goal here, enlightenment, knowledge, power. But Nietzsche and people like that said, then how come you never reach that goal half the time? You got 6 kids and 3 dogs now, but you were on the path of enlightenment 5 minutes ago. Right, so there's something else going on there, but you see, the one where you're feeling the wind in your hair is that I just want to feel myself existing. So if I have a challenge, if I have a mountain to climb, I know I exist. Get out Star Trek 5 and you'll see this all beautifully articulated, the movie. And you'll also say, just like culture does, well, we need enemies. Sure, the left has to have the right? The Jew has to have the Christian to fight. Because my identity is so inherently weak, but it's nicely strengthened if I have something, we all gang up and fight something else, then we're all one, we have camaraderie. Soldiers who fought in wars are like brothers, but the moment the war's over, they never write to each other, and they don't even know who you are. One goes off to be an accountant, the other's a don in a university, the other's, flipping burgers somewhere, right? What was all that camaraderie when the enemy was at the gate? You're going to die for something or other. So we don't have time then now to say that now we are subjective creatures. Let's get into the whole thing of what it means to be a subject. What is subjectivity? We touched on it a little bit in the Julian Jaynes thing. We certainly couldn't do it here at any great length, but it's for people to think about what that actually means, because the wall that you build to keep the world out is also the world that keeps you in, the wall that keeps you in. So is it illusion, all of this movement towards the concretized self? Or is what am I talking about, Michael? That's maturation. That we didn't want original participation. That's why we don't have it. Barfield's wrong. Well, he wasn't wrong because he understood this, that this is a natural Hegelian movement through time, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. The age of idolatry, though, he said, leads to what he called final participation, another thing we haven't got time to talk about, in which there's a restoration of the original numinous state. But in the meantime, we have the other. So when you look at a Jesus, and of course, Moses would be the first one. Moses, the traveling prophet, doesn't need a temple. He can do it on a mountain. He can do it in the desert. He can do it by a well. He is God inspired. He's carrying the word of God with him. But then you get Jesus, or whoever it may be. If they're not killed, well, Jesus was killed. Pythagoras was killed. You see, you'll attract there's a certain danger in saying that I have the God within as well. But generally our world has accepted this, unless you're the Reverend Moon or some other nonsense, right? It goes wrong or the wheel comes off. But guess what? Others have embodied it, and we need to look through the world. Look, even Caesar was the God incarnated. We've got Apollonius of Tyana, as I said, these, Zoroaster. You've got these great ones, and you've got Jesus, and you've got the Pope. So, yeah, you might put yourself at the antagonistic to external authority. But the thing with that is, what happens if some people still need the priest, in sense of that God is within, but somehow there's still a need for the external authority, because the past, those bicameral periods, they haven't faded either. And we seem to be right now in our day and age now, the majority of people in the Western world are crying out for that authority. Is that because the feeling of the God within is weakening? You know, if there is this dichotomy, if there is this compensation between the two, that the turning to the external authorities again may mean that this divinity within is fading. And that will then create another zeitgeist. And if that is the case, then my only answer to that is that, well, a time will come when people just don't want to row their own boat. They tire of being masters of their own fate, their own destiny. Because when the divine is within, don't you have to do a lot of work to purify? Aren't you really the captain of your own ship? But what happens if that gets tiring? Then you're going to come back the other way and say, I'm tired of that. I've tried that. That doesn't work. I'm emptying myself of the divine, or I'm throwing it down. You know, and then we get that. But yeah, that's as far as we can go now for time's sake. You know, maybe we'll explore some of these later on. But when it comes to the Greek, I've mentioned the great work by Kieran Barry, the Greek Kabbalah. If people want to get a little library together on this to help others learn about the antecedents and the cross-pollination, and we haven't even talked about Persians, Egyptians, Mustafa Gadala. I mean, you know, Ralph Ellis would have been one I've mentioned, except for the fact you already know about him and he's been interviewed. This is a really good one. This book is absolutely highly recommended. Can you see that? Yeah, Michael. So this has been my Bible for many a year. This is like another edition. I've bought this one so many times. For those who are really interested, and just look at this. And this is illustrated. It basically goes anything you can think of in the New Testament and shows its Greek origins. An absolute masterpiece, highly recommended. And one day when we have more time, you know, we'll actually discuss this book at length. But I hope that's been interesting to realize that while monotheism, religion, etc., has been developing through the years, so has the personality of the believer, starting around this 8th century era. So if you have any questions, you know, I'd be happy to answer them.
That's fine, Michael. That's fine. Thank you.